Imagine a place where you could explore, battle, trade, and catch Pokemon, all online with other real players visible in the overworld. Everyone talks so much about the golden days of Pokemon. You know, like the GBA and DS days. I mean, the majority of my videos to this point are literally about just that. But today I want to take a step away from those, and hop in the time machine all the way back to the early 2000s, to the first time that it was ever possible to play Pokemon on the computer, and either remind you or fill you in on this incredible for the era game that has since been lost to time. There were no consoles, no cartridges, and no link cables required. Just you, your computer, and Internet Explorer 95. This is the story of Pokemon Crater. So when you're a kid, and probably even more so now, I bet you get bored of doing the same old thing over and over again. And I felt this way too back in my younger days. My brother was getting older, he played games less, and none of my friends really played Pokemon like I did. So I found myself feeling really alone in this vast world of single-player Pokemon. I could only beat Pokemon Emerald so many times before I wanted something fresh. This was way before the days of Discord, Reddit, or Twitter, and the internet was still in its extreme infancy. I was also like 7, so I wasn't looking to talk to strangers in a random chat room or try to find someone who shared similar interests to me online. I remember playing a lot of simple multiplayer browser games at the time, and one day I found myself looking up if there was some way to do that with Pokemon, and that's where I found it. So today I want to look at the origins of this forgotten game, its impact on the Pokemon community, talk about why we loved it, and revisit some of my personal favorite memories while playing. And I also want to invite you to use the comments section as a place to all come together and discuss some of your fond memories from those days, if you remember playing this game or if you have any in general from that time period. And I also need to hear from you guys because I need to know if I'm crazy for the absolute chokehold that this game has on my memory. I swear, I find myself randomly reminiscing on this game once every couple of months. I erase it from my memory, and then like that ex that just doesn't leave you alone, it crawls right back into my brain. So I need to talk about it. But before we get into it, I just want to take a second to personally thank you for watching. And if you enjoy, I'd really appreciate it if you considered subscribing to the channel, because it truly does help me out so much. Anyway, join me on a trip down memory lane as we talk about the rise and fall of this once massively popular Pokemon MMO. So for those of you watching this who weren't blessed enough to experience the game for yourselves, let me paint a picture. And for those of you who were and remember it, let me unlock some memories for you. This is how I remember Pokemon Crater looking and feeling as a kid. I remember getting home from school, throwing down my book bag, and scrambling to the computer to spend hours upon hours on this game in the early 2000s. And it was the absolute best game I ever played in my life up until that point. I mean, the story, the exploration, the battling. Alright, maybe looking back at it, this game wasn't as good as I thought. But here's the thing. Looking at this game over 25 years since the original release, obviously it seems a bit lackluster. But hear me out. Compare this website to other websites of the early 2000s, and it did a fantastic job for the time. Back in the days where every single website looked like a scam site and were all extremely bare bones, this is one that actually had substance comparative to the other sites on the internet around that time. I mean, take a look at Google from the early 2000s and tell me if you saw that website today, you wouldn't think that clicking one of those hyperlinks would end up stealing your social security number and sending your entire checking account balance to some Nigerian prince or something. Yeah, I thought so. So don't be so harsh on the surface to Pokemon Crater. But why did people really love this game so much? Well, for one, up to this point, there were no such thing as emulators. So the only way to access Pokemon was to have the consoles and the games themselves. So first and foremost, Pokemon Crater made Pokemon itself widely accessible to its fanbase, regardless of whether or not you could afford the consoles and the games. Second, there was no such thing as being able to play Pokemon with your friends unless you had something like a link cable. And even then, all you could do was trade and battle. Pokemon Crater made it so that you could actually log in with your friends and roam the overworld online. And the overworld was, in my opinion, the absolute coolest part. It was so awesome to me to go into like a route or a cave or something and just see hundreds of these other sprites just chilling around, doing the same thing that you were doing. The vibes for the time were literally just 10 out of 10. Oh yeah, and you could also catch every single available Pokemon to date in one game. You don't need 7 versions of Pokemon and friends to complete the Pokedex. I remember as a kid walking around slowly, exploring caves with hundreds of other players in the lobby with me. And I just found it so cool that even at that time, so many people had that similar interest as me and found themselves to that creator website. Sure, even back then I still remember the website being like insanely slow, and it makes sense. I don't think that the original developer accounted for that many people being online at the time. But even with its technical limitations, I still absolutely loved it. I do also vividly remember encountering an Entei one day, and then my computer froze because I guess there were too many people on the server, and I had to exit the website and reload it, and the Entei was gone, so the only thing I got out of that encounter was an L. Pokemon Creator also brought a ton of variety to the table. There were so many unique Pokemon introduced into this game. I remember as a kid I didn't realize that there was such a thing as licensed and unlicensed stuff, so I genuinely thought that all the Shadow Pokemon and other variations were real, and I spent time trying to encounter them in my official games. And when I found out they were fake, I was honestly pretty devastated, but then because of the game, I actually didn't believe that shiny Pokemon existed outside of Crater. At first I let myself trust the game and it betrayed me, so I couldn't let it do me like that again. Give me a break, I was like 7. I don't need to hear you guys in the comments telling me that I'm dumb for thinking that Dratini on Fire was real. I wasn't dumb, I was 7. Alright? But seriously, looking back at it now, the innovation with this was really awesome to me. Think about it. There were dark, metallic, shadow, and all the more forms of Pokemon long before we had stuff like that in actual Pokemon. And the cool thing was that each of these forms had specific buffs that made them worth seeking out, which further encouraged players' engagement and exploration throughout the game. Also, back in the 2000s, Pokemon Creator introduced something that hasn't been introduced in Pokemon until like Scarlet and Violet. You could choose from so many different starter options, and even further customize your experience by choosing from a bunch of different sprites to represent your character. You weren't limited to only 3 starter choices, and you didn't have to choose between just boy and girl like in the regular games. You want to be Professor Oak? Alright, go for it. Or what about a Team Rocket or Magma Grunt? Sure, why not? And these small decisions could shape your entire gaming experience. Like if you wanted to choose a Grunt as your avatar, maybe you'd play the game differently than you would if you played as Professor Oak. Like maybe you'd care more about catching strong stuff or something if you're a Grunt, versus if you play as Oak, maybe you want to focus on being a great Pokemon researcher and just rack up on exploration and catching. So essentially, you could build your own in-game personality around the avatar that you choose. I don't know, that's just really cool to me. Further, the game was just simple and straightforward. To me, that's the biggest thing when creating an enjoyable gaming experience. You don't need things to be crazy flashy and complex. Like, I was completely satisfied and fully invested in a simple point-and-click video game, even though it was essentially just a better version of one of those choose-your-own-adventure HTML projects that they make you do when you're learning programming. And get this, it's Pokemon, but you could play it on the computer, which doesn't sound too crazy now because that's how so many people play it, but back then that was like unheard of. And this game did it first. So because of that, Pokemon Creator became a hub for fans who wanted more than just the single-player experience in the Game Boy games. It built a loyal fan base that fostered communities through the forums and the chat rooms that were on the site, and this was massively important in an era before social media, Discord, Reddit, what have you. Creator was just a place for Pokemon fans to truly connect and bond over common interests. And on top of all that, the depth of the game low-key went pretty hard. Like, there was battling in it, you could do trading like I mentioned, but on top of that, you could fight like every single gym leader to date. So it was like a conglomerate of all the Pokemon experiences that you had and then some in one place, which is just insanely awesome to me. But then this begs the question, how could a site that had so much going for it at the time come crashing down to a point that it's been lost to time and forgotten to all but some of us? So the site went offline in 2007, and the exact reason for it being taken down is still a bit unclear, but I think that we could all agree that one of the main reasons was most likely because it was infringing on a lot of Game Freak IP. So shortly after Creator went down, a new site came up in its place called Pokemon Vortex and Pokemon Battle Arena. And here you could do essentially the same things that you could do in Creator. And obviously looking back on it almost 30 years later, it still doesn't look the best, but that's not the point. The point is that this game, in my opinion, was an absolute trailblazer for all the other awesome stuff that we have today. This was the first online experience of Pokemon, and the game itself did so many things right that weren't, and quite frankly still have not been done by Game Freak themselves. You have your modern games like Pokemon Showdown, and a handful of other really awesome Pokemon MMOs that I really don't think would exist today without Pokemon Creator taking that initial leap and inspiring other creators. I bet you that some of these people that created these modern MMOs that are so great played Creator, and that's what inspired them to get into some sorts of game development and the creation of other fan-made Pokemon games. I mean, just look at some of the games that we have today. It's genuinely mind-blowing what people could do. And again, I don't think it would have been done without Crater. So Pokemon Crater may be lost to time, but it certainly wasn't lost in the hearts of all the players who were lucky enough to experience it. Thanks for watching.